Okay, so ready to dive into something that I feel like we encounter all the time, but maybe don't always have a name for.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right, so we're talking about intransigence. You know, that feeling when you just can't seem to find common ground with someone no matter how hard you try.
Ah, yes. I know that feeling all too well.
And you send over some fascinating sources on this. We've got the blog post from Core Solutions, all about how to deal with people who seem intransigent.
Right, right.
And then we've got Merriam-Webster, always a good starting point for a solid definition. Plus that article from Psychology Spot, which gets into like the psychology behind it all.
Really digging into the why of intransigence, that's interesting.
Exactly. So today, let's really try to unpack this whole idea of intransigence, figure out what it is, how to spot it, and maybe even like how to deal with it when it pops up in our lives.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Let's unravel this intransigence knot.
Perfect. So first things first, let's get a clear definition from our trusty Merriam-Webster. They defined intransigent as, and I'm quoting here, characterized by refusal to compromise or to abandon an often extreme position or attitude. And then they add, uncompromising.
Okay, so right off the bat, we're talking about a real unwillingness to budge, to even consider another perspective.
Yeah, it's like that person who's just dug in their heels and refuses to even entertain the possibility of being wrong.
And Merriam-Webster doesn't stop there. They give us the noun form intransigent so we can describe someone as an intransigent person.
Oh, I see, yeah.
And then they throw in the adverb intransigently, like he argued his point intransigently to describe the way someone acts or speaks.
So we're talking about the person, their attitude, and how they behave. It's like a whole intransigence package.
It really does paint a comprehensive picture, doesn't it?
And what's fascinating to me is like the etymology of the word itself. It comes from the Spanish word intransigente, which also means uncompromising. If you go even further back, it's rooted in the Latin transigere, meaning to come to an agreement.
So right there, baked into the origin of the word, is this inherent opposition to finding a compromise.
Right. It's like the word itself is telling us this is about the absence of agreement.
And it makes you wonder about that less common word, transigent.
The opposite, like someone who is willing to compromise.
Exactly. The fact that we rarely use transigent speaks volumes, doesn't it? It really highlights how our focus is often on the lack of compromise, the intransigence when we talk about these situations. It's like that little in prefix completely flips the script.
That's such a good point. And, to help us really grasp all the shades of intransigence, Merriam-Webster provides a whole bunch of synonyms, too. Adamant, bullheaded, stubborn, unyielding. It's like they're giving us the spectrum of unwillingness to budge.
And each synonym, I think, adds a slightly different flavor. Bullheaded, for instance, often implies a lack of reason or logic behind the refusal to compromise.
Yeah, it's like they're charging ahead with their viewpoint, blinders on.
While unyielding might suggest a sort of rigid adherence to their position, maybe even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
So it's not just about disagreeing, it's about the way they hold on to their disagreement.
Exactly, the way they dig in and refuse to consider any alternative.
Yeah. Now, let's switch gears a bit and bring in what we learned from the Psychology Spot article. They describe intransigence as not giving in, but they emphasize that it often goes beyond mere stubbornness.
Oh, how so?
Well, they highlight this idea that intransigence is often fueled by a strong conviction that one's own viewpoint is the correct one, the fair one, the reasonable one. So it's not just about being difficult for the sake of it. It's often driven by a genuine belief in the rightness of their stance.
So there's a deeper layer to it. It's not just about being oppositional. It's about a deeply held belief. That makes things a lot trickier to navigate, for sure.
It really does. And to further clarify the concept, they contrast intransigence with compromise. And get this, compromise actually shares that same Latin root, transigere.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, but the emphasis in compromise is on partially yielding in order to reach an agreement. So it highlights the active choice not to yield that defines intransigence.
So compromise is about finding that middle ground.
Yeah.
Even if it means everyone has to give up a little bit of what they initially wanted. And intransigence is the complete rejection of that process. It's like saying, nope, my way or the highway.
Exactly. And what I found really interesting is that the Psychology Spot article points out that we can view intransigence in different ways. Sometimes it's seen as a positive trait, like tenacity or sticking to your principles. But then there's the flip side, stubbornness, inflexibility.
It sounds like context plays a huge role in how we perceive intransigence.
Totally. I mean, think about it. If someone is being intransigent in the face of injustice, standing up for what they believe in, we might admire their unwavering commitment.
Right, like a whistleblower who refuses to back down, even when facing immense pressure. We often see that as a form of courage.
Exactly. But then, if someone is being intransigent in a situation where flexibility and collaboration are needed, it can be incredibly frustrating and even damaging.
Like in a team project where one person refuses to budge on their idea, even if it's clearly not working, that can really hinder progress.
And they actually give a really powerful example of this in the article. They talk about the intransigence of the Royal Army Medical Corps accounting systems during World War I.
Wait, accounting systems during a war? What does that have to do with intransigence?
Well, apparently, this rigid, inflexible system prevented doctors from recognizing and properly treating what we now know as war neurosis, also known as shell shock.
Wow.
And because of this unyielding system, countless soldiers suffered needlessly. It's a really stark example of how damaging intransigence can be, even in seemingly bureaucratic areas.
That's a really sobering example. It shows how intransigence, even when it's not about one individual being stubborn, can have real human costs.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture. And the article goes on to say that while being uncompromising can be necessary at times, it's important to be mindful that it doesn't become our default mode. Because when it does, it prevents us from adapting, evolving, and finding solutions in a world that's constantly changing.
It's about knowing when to hold firm to your principles and when to be open to other perspectives, other ways of doing things.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears again and talk about what to do when we encounter intransigence in others. And this is where the Core Solutions blog post comes in handy, offering some really practical advice.
Yeah, because understanding what intransigence is one thing, but figuring out how to deal with it in real-life situations is a whole other challenge.
Totally. So one of the key strategies they suggest is to work with the people who are trying to find a resolution.
Okay, what do you mean by work with?
Well, it's about trying to understand the perspective of the person who seems intransigent, like what's driving their unyielding stance.
I see. Trying to get to the root of the issue.
Exactly. And they offer some specific tactics for doing this, like trying to surprise them with a different angle on the problem.
So shaking them out of their fixed mindset, so to speak.
Yeah, kind of. Or like really acknowledging their viewpoint, even if you disagree with it. The idea is to make them feel heard and valued, which might make them more open to reconsidering their position.
That makes sense. It's about creating a space where they feel safe enough to maybe let go of their rigid stance.
And they also suggest bringing up psychological concepts like unconscious bias, even mentioning Kahneman's thinking fast and slow.
Interesting. How does that play into dealing with intransigence?
Well, it's about pointing out that we all have these automatic patterns of thinking that can influence our judgments, whether we realize it or not. So by bringing this up, you're not directly attacking their position, but you're inviting them to consider that their own perspective might be subject to these biases as well.
It's like introducing a neutral lens, a scientific framework, to help them see things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And I thought this was a really cool idea, using mediator questions, but not necessarily asking them directly.
What do you mean?
Well, like instead of saying, what's really important to you here, you might just think about that question in your own mind. Or instead of asking, what are the potential downsides of not finding a solution, you might simply consider those downsides yourself.
I see. So it's about prompting a deeper reflection, even if it's just happening internally.
Yeah, and the hope is that it might spark a shift in their thinking, even if they don't outwardly express it.
And, I think it's important to remember that what someone says isn't always the whole story. Their behavior in one situation might not be a reflection of who they are as a person.
That's another key point from Core Solutions, challenging our own assumptions. We tend to jump to conclusions about why someone is being intransigent, but those assumptions can actually make the situation worse.
It's like we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we assume someone is just being difficult, we're less likely to approach them with empathy and understanding.
And speaking of seeing the bigger picture, they also talk about the importance of considering the long-term implications of the situation. Like, what are the potential consequences of not finding a resolution?
And they bring up bétonnés and woitans, right? Your best and worst alternatives to a negotiated agreement.
Right. So thinking about your bétonné can help you determine your walkaway point. Like when is it better to just walk away from the negotiation altogether? And considering your woitane can help you assess the risks involved in not reaching an agreement.
It's about having a clear understanding of the potential outcomes so you can make informed decisions.
And finally, they mention the possibility of bringing in a neutral third party, someone who can help facilitate the conversation and offer a fresh perspective.
Like a mediator.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes having someone who's not emotionally invested in the situation can help break the deadlock.
It's like they can see the forest for the trees, while those involved are caught up in the details.
Totally. So the main takeaway from core solutions seems to be that even when faced with what appears to be unshakable intransigence, there are things you can do to try and nudge things in a more productive direction.
And even if you don't see immediate results, you might be planting seeds for future change.
Okay, so let's bring this all back to our listeners. Why does understanding intransigence even matter in your everyday life?
Well, because recognizing it, both in yourself and in others, can be incredibly valuable for communication, for building relationships, for problem solving.
It's like having this extra tool in your toolkit for navigating those tricky situations where people just can't seem to agree.
And I think the biggest takeaway is that intransigence isn't just about stubbornness. There's often more to it than that.
Like what?
It could stem from deeply held beliefs, maybe even fears or insecurities that they're not consciously aware of. It could be a lack of cognitive flexibility, that ability to shift perspectives.
So it's about recognizing that there might be more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And when you start to consider those possibilities, it can change the way you approach those seemingly immovable people and situations. It can open the door for empathy and understanding.
It's like that aha moment when you realize, oh, this isn't just about them being difficult. There's something else at play here.
And that realization can be a game changer in terms of how you communicate and interact with them.
So to wrap up our deep dive, let's recap the key points. Intransigence, at its core, is a refusal to compromise.
And while there might be rare situations where standing your ground is absolutely necessary, intransigence often creates roadblocks to progress and understanding.
It can lead to conflict, frustration, and missed opportunities.
And here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about a time when you might have been perceived as intransigent or when you encountered intransigence in someone else. What were the underlying reasons for that unyielding stance? And how might recognizing those reasons lead to more productive and compassionate conversations in the future?
That's something for everyone to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.